Good afternoon from Kuala Lumpur and as well as Canberra, I suppose. To say that the topic today is topical is a real understatement. Australia-China relations has is going through some turbulent times, and here at the Institute of Strategic International Studies in Malaysia, we are looking at this very closely. We're essentially looking at how Australia is managing this issue, how it is trying to balance between pushing back against activities that it considers against its interests by China, and as well as adapting or trying to be pragmatic about the whole situation, by adapting to the new normal, as it were. So here we have with us Professor John Blaxland. He is with the Strategic and Defense Studies Center. Incidentally, both of us here moderating today are proud products of the SDSC, and we are very glad to host Professor John Blaxland, who is a professor of international security and international studies. He has written about the Australian Secret Intelligence Organization, ASIO, recently, and is currently working on a new book on the Australian signals. Signals. What is it? ASD signals. What do you call it, John?
Directory.
ASD. Well, we'll just call it ASD. With me is Ms. Iza Ibrahim. She'll be taking over. Essentially, she will be the ringleader during the Q&A after Professor Blaxland speaks for about half an hour. I won't waste any time by reading out his bio. What I'll do is put a link to his bio in the chat window. All of you are welcome to ask questions in the Q&A window, as well as raise your hands if you wish to make an intervention by audio. But please wait until Professor Blaxland has finished his presentation. Well, I know why you're all here. You're not here to hear from me. You're here to hear from John Blaxland. So I'll just pass it on to you, John, and we'll have right. We'll do half an hour with you, and then quickly finish off with the Q&A of 45 minutes. Thanks very much, John. Yeah.
Well, terrific. Thank you very much for the warm welcome, and it's a great honour and a pleasure for me to be here with you virtually in Kuala Lumpur, if not physically. It's a great topic. Thank you for inviting me to speak on the end of certainty, Australia and the rise of Xi's China. As we know, no one knows the future, but we have history as a guide. And while history doesn't repeat, it certainly appears to rhyme. And I think we need to listen carefully to the rhythms of that historical account. And what I want to do is give you a little bit of a historical context for Australia's position, to then preface some remarks about the current situation and my sense of where things are going into the future. Australia has long had a fear of abandonment, and Alan Gingell wrote about this. And it's very clear that Australia has relied on the United Kingdom for the first half of the 20th century until the failure of the Singapore strategy in 1942, and then on the United States. 1942 resonates in Australia's strategic consciousness. The 8th Australian Division fought in Malaya, was captured in Singapore, and spent the rest of the war in captivity, building the Thai-Burma Railway, amongst other things. Originally, the idea was we would have security from Asia. But over time, we've come to see that we sought to have security with Asia, and particularly countries like Malaysia. 1949 saw the end of the so-called century of humiliation that started really with the Opium Wars a century earlier. But that came just as the so-called Iron Curtain was falling, and George Kennan's famous telegram was written. We saw the emergence of this sense of a domino theory that not only China, but then Korea, and then perhaps Vietnam, and then perhaps Malaysia and Indonesia, and then maybe Australia would be subject to waves of communist influence. We signed the ANZUS agreement with the United States in 1951 as part of the Japanese peace treaty arrangements, in large part because of fear that a resurgent Japan was something that Australia wanted to hedge against. not realizing what would happen after that. Of course, what happened also and emerged from the Second World War was this idea of the Five Eyes intelligence links, and Australia is integrally linked to that. And of course, I'm on a project dealing with that issue. In 1954, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization was formed in large part a response to this fear of communism, Chinese and Soviet communism. That went on for a couple of decades. It was a little bit dysfunctional, in part because it had the colonial powers and some of the local powers mixing and not really agreeing on issues. 1957, Australia signed up to this Anglo-Malayan defence arrangement that saw Australia and New Zealand commit to the defence of Malaya, as it was then, just as the United Kingdom was considering leaving after the Suez Crisis of 1956, that saw that massive inflection point that when a British power was eclipsed following the debacle on the Suez Canal in 1956. 1960s, we saw confrontasi with Indonesia and Australia siding with Malaysia in that confrontation. Interestingly enough, of course, despite Australia pleading for American support, the United States wanted to stay well and truly away from that particular conflict. Similarly, over West Papua, Australia was eager to make sure that the Papuan people were part of a united Papua New Guinea island, because the Dutch had held onto it after 1949. They hadn't given it to Indonesia at Indonesia's independence in 1949. But of course, Australia wasn't successful in persuading the United States of that view. And of course, that's a fait accompli. Now we recognize Papua as part of Indonesia. But it did speak to a certain uncertainty about the relationship between Australia and the United States. Just as we were still worried very much about a communist China under Mao Zedong, we were worried about the United States perhaps being a little bit fickle. And Australia committed to the Vietnam War, in part because of our desire to strengthen our ties with the United States and to make sure that they felt a reciprocal tie to us. The Five-Power Defence Arrangement emerges in 1971 as Britain withdraws. This organisation, almost 50 years old now, arguably an anachronism, but one that has incredible resonance still to this day for the countries that are participating in that space. It keeps Australia and New Zealand engaged in mainland Southeast Asia, particularly through the facilities at Butterworth. It keeps the UK involved, and it keeps Singapore and Malaysia talking nicely to each other, amongst other things. But the sense of concern about abandonment that I mentioned at the outset, from referring to Alan Gingel's excellent book, is complemented by a fear of entrapment at the same time. And so our engagement in places like Malaysia and elsewhere in the region are calibrated to give us options and to not give undue promises of support that might commit Australia to obligations that we don't want to necessarily support. Now, you'll recall China's Premier Deng Xiaoping talked about hiding your capacities and biding your time. And of course, for a while there, that was on and off again. The 1962 Sino-Indian War, a success for the Communist Chinese, a humiliating defeat for India, was then followed a decade and a half later by the 1979 Vietnam War, when China got a bloody nose at the hands of the still quite militarily honed Vietnamese, who had only a few years earlier, defeated and conquered South Vietnam. A decade later, the Tiananmen Square massacre takes place. Australia's Prime Minister offers asylum to 42,000 Chinese students in Australia at that time, and it tearfully makes this pronouncement in Australia's Parliament. And yet, only a few years later, in the 1990s, we see that sense of foreboding about the trajectory of China is put away in the cupboard, if you like, particularly as US President Bill Clinton touted the significance of the internet as the great liberalizing phenomenon that would that would see a liberalisation take place as the market economic dynamics affected China, as Deng Xiaoping's open liberalisation economically led to significant growth. There was a sense of the inevitability of this emerging as a period of liberalisation politically as well. Of course, we now know that that wasn't the case. In 1999, the crisis in East Timor, the United States was reluctant to help. Thailand, the Philippines, Malaysia did, and we're very grateful for that support. And the collegiality and the collaboration, the regional collaboration that we saw then was very significant. And it pointed to, I think, a very significant phenomenon about the way Australia and its regional neighbours can collaborate. A bit like we had done in 1993 and 94 over the Cambodian peace settlement, the Paris Peace Accord, and the settlement and the rehabilitation of Cambodia into the family of nations that Malaysia and Australia contributed to actively as well. Now, we saw after 1999, in 2000, President Bush talked about what my colleague Nina Seelove described as the pivot before the pivot, a sense that China was actually rising in a way that that actually potentially presented a significant challenge for the United States. Not that others were particularly worried at that time, but there was a concern emerging that idea of that article, the pivot before the pivot, was this sense of the United States starting to orientate back towards China out of concern about its military rise. The EP3 incident over Hainan Island in April 2001 seemed to confirm this sense that China was getting belligerent, China was getting assertive. And yet at the same time, Australia and others, the United States, Malaysia, etc., welcomed China into the membership of the World Trade Organization late in 2001. Australia, amongst many other nations, welcomed China's emergence. And yet then in 9/11, 11th of September 2001, we saw the so-called onset of the so-called global war on terror, where the United States got gravely distracted by events in Afghanistan and then in Iraq, and Australia followed suit. And then we see, interestingly enough, in 2002, ASEAN is engaging China, seeking to have a declaration on the code of conduct for the South China Sea. There's growing concern about China's assertiveness in this space, and China agrees to a declaration that there will be a code of conduct. And yet here we are 18 years later, still waiting for that code of conduct to materialize. So there's a sense of growing concern that China is actually playing us, that China is not actually going to become this open, liberal society that we can all happily rejoice in its rise. This is something that has generated concerns. Nonetheless, in October 2003, Australia's Prime Minister at the time, John Howard, welcomed President Bush and then the next day, President Hu Jintao to Australia's Parliament, demonstrating to both that Australia was keen to keep the door open for both relationships. And that continued, and we saw in 2007, China becomes Australia's largest trading partner. This is a tipping point. It eclipses Japan, that had been for Australia's largest trading partner for decades. And then the 2008, the global financial crisis and the Beijing Olympics, we see another significant inflection point. This is where arguably China no longer feels the need to follow Deng's precept of hiding and biting. We see in 2009, President Obama commit the so-called pivot to Asia, in part a reflection of their growing concern about no longer biting, no longer hiding. And that gets renamed the rebalance, but that doesn't really amount to very much, in part because of the ongoing distractions in the Middle East. But in the meantime, we see President Xi coming to office in 2012 as he rises as the head of state, comes out to be a surprisingly authoritarian leader. There had been hope that Xi would be a liberal-minded reformer who would take Deng's reforms further and assure all those American and Western investors in China that China was going to play along and be part of the system, not establish a new system and not seek to overthrow the system. The decision in 2012, however, to claim Scarborough Shoal and to eject the Philippines from the Scarborough Shoal, and then the President Obama's decision to do nothing about it, to not invoke the security treaty that the United States had with Manila, sent basically a green light for what happened then. From 2014 onwards, we see the artificial island construction and the assertion of the 9-dash line. And who'd heard of the 9-dash line prior to about 2012, 2013? We knew it was written in 1947, but really it hadn't been talked about seriously by anyone of any consequence until very recently. So this 9-dash line comes into vogue, and then China starts asserting itself in this space, impinging on the exclusive economic zones of Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines in a way that initially no one really wants to kick up too much of a fuss about, but over time there's growing angst about what this means. Of course, particularly as those artificial islands get built and consolidated, this is a really worrying development. In 2015, we see the Darwin Port lease, a 99-year lease to the Chinese company Landbridge. This is a point where growing concern emerges in Australia. The Foreign Investment Review Board is given a different security perspective, and they, from that point on, no longer view China's actions in investment terms as a neutral thing. It's now seen in a more adversarial sense. 2016, we see the President Trump come to office, and what I think transpires is what I would call the United States' transactional retreat from ideational leadership. We see them abandon the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They walk away from that and other UN bodies. At the same year that we see the arbitral tribunal ruling in favour of Philippines President Aquino's case before the arbitral tribunal, and that basically upholds the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and rejects the legality of the 9-dash line. But then, of course, Rodrigo Duterte comes into office and rejects it in the trying to make friends with China. And here we are 4 years later, and that strategy has not worked. We saw essentially ASEAN's acquiescence to this. No one really kicked up a fuss. Then President Trump tries to engage with Kim Jong-un, a distraction from engaging with some of the substance over these types of issues. And about this time in 2017, we see the Australian Foreign Policy White Paper emerge. And I would call it Australia's Foreign Policy Plan B. Why? I call it a Plan B because essentially it's about recognizing that we still give due deference to the US alliance, but it's about building deeper relations with others in the neighborhood, because there's a growing sense that we need to help each other out. The challenges are growing, the uncertainty is growing, the confrontation is growing, and the only way we can actually look to consolidate and protect our interests is to work collaboratively with others, including Malaysia. And that then we see in 2018 and 2019, the Huawei bans starting to happen. Australia takes the lead on that, and others follow suit. There's a real sense that the 5G technology that China has been taking a leading role in is subject to Chinese state laws that demands extraterritorial access to the data. And we see the spike in cyber attacks. My own university, the Australian National University, has been subject to cyber attacks on an industrial scale that has generated considerable unease about what's happening, and a recognition by and large that this is, if not exclusively, but largely about Chinese interference and not much else. Then we come to 2020 and we see the black swan event of all times, the pandemic, and conjecture about what happened and why. Concern about how it is that what happened in Wuhan, the virus spreading quickly and with information being withheld, then the World Health Organization being constrained from being frank and fearless about declaring a pandemic. The question then arises, was this inadvertent? How much of this did President Xi know about in advance? And the effect is, it is just catastrophic globally. I mean, I don't need to tell anybody this. The effect is nonetheless, as if it is deliberate, yet without allowing for direct retaliation. So as much as this is as catastrophic an effect as a world war, arguably, economically, the setback is extraordinary around the world. The first world, the countries of the OECD are dramatically affected, setback years, if not decades. There is a real concern about what this means. For the European Union, there's major social and economic disruption and dislocation, and in the United States, it's even greater. And the effect there is not just economic, but it's social. The disruption is profound, and that is generating considerable pushback. It's happening in Australia. There's been protests about the so-called Black Lives Matter movement happening even in Sydney today. Now, this comes to where we are today. And today, I think we hear an echo of Samuel Huntington's thesis of the clash of civilizations, in which he described Australia as a torn country. And I don't think that's a fair representation. Australia is a remarkable country that 53 years ago stepped away from the white Australia policy, has become a very multicultural country, an inclusive country, and one that has been a huge beneficiary of migration from many countries, tens of thousands of whom have come from Malaysia. And across Southeast Asia and beyond. Now, about 12% of Australia's population is Asian, and that is an extraordinary feat. About 4% from Northeast Asia, 4% from Southeast Asia, and 4% from South Asia. But today, trade-wise, the People's Republic of China dominates. It dominates in minerals, it dominates in agriculture, and it has, at least until the last couple of months, dominated in education. Yet foreign direct investment is dominated categorically by the United States. They invest about $714 billion in Australia, and the bilateral investment arrangement is about $1.4 trillion, nearly $1.5 trillion. So it remains a significant economic factor. So it is not simply an equation for Australia of security with the United States and economics with China. The foreign direct investment means that the security and the economics is all tangled up for Australia. But for Australia also, Northeast Asia, the Republic of Korea and Japan remain very important trading partners. And when you aggregate Southeast Asia, ASEAN is actually Australia's third largest trading partner. And the South China Sea trade routes are a vital shared space in which Australia maintains considerable concern, not because of what's happening now, but about what might happen, and about the lack of freedom of action, the prospect for blackmail, the prospect for coercion, additional coercion beyond what we're already seeing, that emerges from conceding too much territory in that space. So, interestingly, we've just signed the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Arrangement with Indonesia. This is, I think, part of Australia's foreign policy plan B, if you like, reaching out to regional partners, seeking to deepen our economic, trade and other ties across the neighbourhood. So, as I say, we've got arguably what could be described as a slightly schizophrenic nation. We've got security and foreign direct investment with the United States. We've got trade with Asia, in that space, China looms large. But what we've also seen this year is the emergence of wolf warrior diplomacy, and that is, I guess it's scaring the horses, if I can use that metaphor. We've seen it in the Himalayas. We've seen it off the waters of Vietnam. Malaysia has experienced it. It's been a first-hand experience of this in dealing with their own confrontation with the maritime Chinese vessels operating in Malaysia's exclusive economic zone, the Philippines as well. But it's happening in other parts of the world, in the South Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, and in Africa. So what does Australia do about this? Well, we remain essentially Anglo-European transplanted community, but we're invested in the neighbourhood. As I say, about 12% Asian community now in Australia. We are more connected to the neighbourhood than ever. We remain the United States' closest ally, but as my colleague who wrote an excellent book, Independent Ally, makes clear, Australia is tied to the United States, but it isn't. It makes up its own mind about its foreign policy. It is an independent actor. And so in that sense, it is very much an independent ally. And of course, another colleague of mine, Ian Henry, has written an excellent article in International Security about the fact that Australia's interests don't always completely overlap with those of the United States. So we have different interests, but there are overlaps, and where they do overlap, there is an alignment that is enduring. It seems to me, between the United States' interests and Australia's. They are different though, and there is a difference on the trade front, especially. The United States is now talking about decoupling. Of course, for Australia, that's not really feasible. Australia exports minerals, agriculture, and that is not something that there are alternative places for us to trade with, or alternative sources for China to purchase from either. So there is a tie there that's enduring and consequential for both China and Australia. Interestingly, as we think about China's engagement in the Pacific, Australia has been impressing what we call the Pacific Step Up, mindful that China is more active in places like Kiribati and Tonga and Solomon Islands than ever before. And this is raising considerable alarm bells in Australia. I've advocated that we set up a grand compact for the Pacific, not just because of great power contestation, but because of the looming environmental catastrophe, as well as the spectrum of governance challenges in this space. The Quad has been talked about, and we've seen engagement on the Quad. And this is, in some circles, particularly from Beijing, seen as an attempt to encircle China. And there is a certain resonance to that idea, but I think we have to be realistic about what we can expect the Quad to be. Australia has in terms of land power terms, little to offer. India, with its major land borders with Pakistan particularly, and China, its land forces, its air forces don't really need us. Where we might be able to help, or we might be able to collaborate, is with our navies in the Indian Ocean. But even then, India is a country, a proudly independent country, one that doesn't want to be tied down by alliances or obligations that might not necessarily work in its interests. So we have to be realistic about that. And then there's very interesting to see what's happening in Indonesia, particularly over the issue of the Natuna Islands and the exclusive economic zone, over which the 9-dash line overlaps, and China's assertive action inside Indonesia's EEZ and the overlapping space there. Well, it's very interesting to see President Joko Widodo respond to that, and the opportunities there for greater collaboration between Australia and Indonesia. We've had a prickly relationship with Indonesia. Arguably, it's been a bit like a game of snakes and ladders. If you recall, in the game of snakes and ladders, you can go up incrementally up the ladder to get to the end point, but you've got to beware of the snakes where you can get put back down to the start. And we have, over a number of issues, be it beef, boat spies, clemency Timor, Papua or Jerusalem, had our rub points with Indonesia. But the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement does augur well for the relationship. Jokowi and our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, do seem to get on quite well. And there does seem to be an opportunity there. And our defence forces are collaborating to an extent not seen in a long time. And of course, we've seen also in the five-power defence arrangement space, Indonesian liaison officers. So the FPDA construct is no longer seen as something to be feared in the way it was in the past. And that, I think, is a very positive thing. So relations with other states in the neighbourhood is clearly important. Now, so that's the situation today, but what about the future? Where are we going and what are the options we face? Well, it really depends on a couple of things, and of course we don't know the answer to them. One is, does China's rise, does it continue exponentially? Does it continue uninterrupted? Or does it plateau? And do others like India catch up? Does Japan recover from its apparent death spiral? Has Xi overreached? Are there any doves in the wings waiting to take office, to take over from him? Is a US resurgence likely or even possible? Is what we're seeing a meltdown of the United States from the core? Or is this a lapse like we saw in the 1970s, in the post-Vietnam War years, where protests, oil crises, and a weak presidential arrangement saw Iran, take hostages, and the United States humiliated, and people talk about the eclipse of American power and the loss of the Cold War, only for that to be completely turned around a decade later. The situation, the contrast between 1979 and 1989, when the Berlin Wall falls, and on the cusp of the implosion of the Soviet Union, speaks to this sense that maybe there is still hope for the United States. But of course, we can't bank on that. And that's where Australia's strategic update of 2020 comes in. I talked about the 2017 Foreign Policy Plan B, looking for other neighbour connections. I would argue that this one is Australia's Defence Plan B. Why? Because we stress the alliance with the United States, but it doesn't get the kind of stress it used to get. It's useful, it's important, and it's important for a number of things. We've doubled down on the ties with the United States because of the value of the intelligence links, because of the value of the access to the high technology, hypersonics, advanced fighter aircraft, missile satellite technology, and so on, because we're already invested in terms of interoperability, because we're invested in the relationship, we're a trusted agent, we have liaison officers and exchange officers peppered throughout the US military hierarchy. And then, of course, there's the X factor. What is the X factor, you say? It's what the United States might do in a support of Australia in a crisis. And here we get back to the point I made at the very start about 1942. Who came to Australia's rescue in 1942? The United States. It remains the predominant military power despite the burning of the Bonhomme Richard. It still is a remarkable power, and one that is extremely powerful, extremely capable, and yet even though relatively on the wane, it is one that is not going away, at least for the rest of this century, in my not so humble opinion. So given all that, the X factor, the ties of the United States, what else do we do? Well, I say this Australian strategic update, it's focused on the neighbourhood. And what does that mean? It means bolstering regional ties. And here it means countries in ASEAN. The ASEAN Defence Ministers Meeting Plus construct and the expert working groups are seen as very useful for Australia, very important, but we also recognise the limitations of those expert working groups and of the ASEAN fora because of the fact that it is based on consensus, and consensus is not guaranteed when only one country needs to be bought off, let alone any of the other ones. So what do? Well, we've got the five-power defence arrangement. Not that we want to bank too much on that, nobody wants to, but it is a very useful platform for us to remain engaged in with Singapore and with Malaysia and with New Zealand and the United Kingdom, to be frank. But I think there's some other sub-regional forums emerging. We've seen one that Maurice Payne backed a couple of years ago on counterterrorism, that Malaysia engaged with Indonesia and the Philippines and Australia about. But there are other issues as well, mimicking, I guess, to a certain extent, the Bali process, but perhaps on a smaller basis in our own neighbourhood. And here, I put to you an idea that's been floating for a couple of years now, a way to make sweet our relations in the neighbourhood. And by that, I mean make manis. Manis being the word for sweet, but also potentially the acronym for Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, and Singapore. I propose a Maritime Regional Cooperation Forum, a way for Malaysia, Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand to work collaboratively and in a trusting way with Indonesia. It may get up, it may not. I put to you that we need to think imaginatively and creatively about shared concerns. Malaysia, like Australia, is very interested in seeing relations with China stay on an even keel and keep the United States engaged as well. Like us, you have a lot of foreign direct investment from the United States. You have a lot of investment from China. Like you, we see the role of Japan as being significant to security and stability in the neighborhood. We share so much, we have so much in common, we have a shared history, we have shared interests. And I think this is the thing that is particularly interesting. Those interests are enduring. The overlap of our interests is what it matters. And of course, one of the things that's very interesting as we think about wolf warrior diplomacy is how China is very keen to avoid us working multilaterally. And we need to be asserting our interests, our rights, our needs to collaborate more effectively and not be afraid of the barking, if you like, that comes from Beijing when it is in our interests, our shared interests, to stand up and not be intimidated by the bark. So look, I've extended for a while now. I appreciate the opportunity, and I'm really looking forward now to the questions and answer session. And thank you very much.
Thank you, John. That was really fantastic. We'll start with the Q&A. As in, sorry, there's a slight feedback coming from our side. We'll start with the Q&A in a bit. Can I just use the privilege of being the moderator here to ask you a question first? It's about your plan. I mean, about the Australian Plan B, about engaging ASEAN, about engaging Southeast Asia in a bigger way. What would have to happen for that Plan B to be no longer feasible? What would have to happen for people in Canberra to say, you know what, they're too afraid of the bucks coming out from Big Brother. They can't make any decisions. They're hedging, and they don't spend enough on defense anyway. What would have to happen for Australia to say, you know what, we are on our own or with Americans, then that's it. Is there a scenario where you think that Plan B becomes invalid?
No, to be honest, I don't see that as a feasible scenario. I think Australia has got a long way to go in investing further, because I think we've been distracted for 2 decades with the Middle East, much like the United States has. But we need to double down on our investing in our relationships with Malaysia and across Southeast Asia and the South Pacific. So the idea of it doesn't seem feasible for me for us to walk away from any of those relationships. They're too important to us. Australia is a middle power, but yes, we're an island, but we're an internationally connected one. We're dependent on trade. We're dependent on goodwill. We're dependent on you and all your neighbours and our neighbours, all collaboratively adhering to the concept of the rules-based order, so that we can trade with trust and confidence that you'll pay, that our ships will get there, that they won't get sunk, that they won't get robbed, and that the goods will arrive safely and in a way that is usable. These are all things that, the fact that we have to articulate that speaks to the uncertainty we face today. But these are some of the things that we have for decades taken for granted, because much like, there's a saying, oxygen is something it's fundamental to life, but you don't notice it until you don't have it. And that's a bit like with security. We have taken for granted, I think, the American umbrella, the security umbrella, which has caused rub points for many countries over the years, but countries like Malaysia and Australia have been enormous beneficiaries of that presence, of that stability that has facilitated prosperity. The stability has facilitated prosperity, and it's actually becoming a little bit precarious because of the uncertainty. And so my sense is that while there may be in some circles a sense of, oh, well, we should just give up, I don't think we should ever seriously contemplate giving up, collaborating with each other, working effectively to bolster security and stability, to bolster confidence in the rules, to bolster confidence in international organizations, and that's a message for the United States as much as it is a message for the People's Republic of China and Russia as well. There are a number of states out there that are happy to play in a fairly cowboy-esque manner, taking a cavalier approach to the fabric of the international order that we've all been the beneficiaries of, and we should be very, very careful about treating that with disdain, because to contemplate the unraveling of that order is to contemplate a grave set of circumstances, the likes of which would make the Great Depression of the 1930s pale into insignificance.
Thanks very much, John. Isa, would you take over? My colleague Isa Ibrahim, who's a researcher with the Foreign Policy and Security Studies program.
Thank you for that. We'll be looking through the Q&A right now. At the moment, we have 7 questions and we'll be answering. We're still open to questions for anyone interested. Also, just as a reminder, if you want to write them down, you can use the Q&A, or you can actually just raise your hand if you would like to speak verbally. It's fine as well, don't worry. Okay, so the first question has quite a few upvotes for this one too. It's from Tansri Munir. He asked that, how can Australia and what must they do to shake off the image of being America's sheriff in the Asia Pacific, or shall we say Indo-Pacific? And why is Australia still perceived as a white country in the region? Is it then surprising that China can take full advantage of any of Australia's vulnerabilities?
Great questions, thank you. Look, let me just say the deputy sheriff tag, that was something that was thrown at John Howard about 20 years ago, and he didn't actually agree, he just failed to actively disagree with that moniker. And it has unfortunately stuck with him for a long time. The bottom line is that, you know, there is an overlap between American interests and Australian interests. And quite often it seems like Australia is just doing America's bidding. But I can assure you that Australian foreign policy is based on hard-nosed calculations of what Australian political leaders and bureaucratic advisors consider to be Australia's national interests. And they just happen quite often to overlap with American ones. But I've highlighted a number of instances in my talk when they did not overlap and when there was a clear difference of interests. And Australia has actually quite actively on a number of instances disagreed with the United States and quite publicly and privately voiced those concerns. So this idea of us just being a deputy sheriff is really a caricature of a much more nuanced picture. And as to the image of Australia being white, I challenge you to come to Sydney or Melbourne. I mean, once everything's settled down, of course, once the air bridges open up again, and see for yourself. These are cities and places where they're very cosmopolitan, they're very multicultural. You know, the opposition foreign affairs spokesman Penny Wong. I mean, that very surname speaks volumes about the fact that we have more diversity here than most people are prepared to acknowledge, and it's a convenient convenient foil for those seeking to be critical of Australia to talk about us being white. And it's very easy, and Australians are amongst the most critical of themselves about their own racism. But I put to you, name a country that isn't racist. Tell me where in the world there isn't racism. Tell me anywhere in the world that is more accepting and more inclusive than a country like Australia. I actually think we're a pretty good country. You know, there's no question it's difficult for migrants, but it's a relative concept. Australia is becoming more inclusive, more diverse. And let's not forget, it was only 53 years ago we abandoned the White Australia policy. So in 53 years, we've got to 12% of Asian migration, and that's not to include people from Africa or from Latin America or from other parts of Europe. So you know, you come here, you see quite a diverse place. I think that's answered the question, but I'm happy to stand corrected and
Actually,
elaborate further.
John, we have a follow-up by Tantra Mune himself. We invite him to speak as well for his follow-up.
Hello. Have I been unmuted?
Yes, go
we
ahead.
can hear you. Thank
Hi,
you.
Professor. Thank you for your presentation. It is not an allegation about Australia or against Australia. It is more a perception of Australia. So you can't shake it off. That's so difficult. There seems to be a missing link between your protestations of your commonalities, your connections, and common interests with Southeast Asia and your neighborhood. Even the use of the word neighborhood, seems to be perhaps not right. In the sense that people talk about the neighborhood as something that you cannot avoid. Rather than your friends or your engaged parties. So I think the concept of neighborhood itself perhaps is a problem in terms of appearing, to be part and parcel of one region. So I think that this missing link is something I believe that Australians have to really look, deeply into. How can we engage better and be understood better? For example, when the Americans alleged that the virus was a Chinese virus, Wuhan virus, Australia then followed up by, asking and demanding of, as the Chinese saw it, of explanation about how this virus spread. Why was it not in the Australian interest, given it has a common interest in the region, to talk to the region and say, why don't we ask together of China, what happened? So what happened instead was, after the Americans had, pushed the questions or thrust the questions at the Chinese, Australia did the same. And, as a consequence, it is not part of the region. You could have spoken to the region. We're all interested in the virus, how it originated and how it spread. So I think perhaps, Australia needs to engage the region more, in terms of some of the initiatives it makes, particularly in relation to China. So I think this missing link is something that should be sort of hit at, all the time, to see how are we missing it? Why are we missing it? How are we not engaging? Why are we not connected when we see we are? Sorry, I've gone on a bit. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. Excellent question and excellent observation. I would just add, though, that it's very easy to criticize Australia for doing what it does. But I think, Malaysia, the rest of Southeast Asia and the region, the world, is actually a beneficiary of Australia doing this. And yes, there's no question Australia has a reputation of being a little bit klutzy and clodhopping. We're not very nuanced in our diplomacy. We're not known for our, soft touch. We are, we're ex-convict stock, as you know. We tend to be fairly blunt, and that sometimes works in the interests of the region and sometimes not. But I would put to you that sometimes it's kind of convenient for Malaysia and other countries for Australia to do this, and maybe for you to actually be at arm's length, but actually be a beneficiary of Australian being pushy and a little bit rude, if you like, but nonetheless working in a way that is in the common interest, which is for some truth to come out and for us all to be the beneficiaries of knowing how the Wuhan virus transpired and what we can do to mitigate the risk of it recurring. That to me is there's no question. You are probably right, and I don't know, because I don't know what our ambassadors were doing and our high commissioners were doing in terms of engaging in KL or in Bangkok or in Singapore or in Jakarta in the lead up to that announcement. I don't know. I would like to think that they were consulted, that there was a mechanism for them to go out and reach out and advise, at least to give as a courtesy, advice to that effect. Now, look, I recognize also we have a bad track record of doing this very clumsily and clumsily, particularly with our most important neighbor, Indonesia, which is Malaysia's very important neighbor as well. you know, we're a bit clod hopping that way. There's no question, but it's not malice of forethought necessarily. It's perhaps just a little bit of lack of sophistication. And as I say, I actually think sometimes that works in your favour. You know, it's good to have Australia being the outlier, being the loud, rude one in the neighbourhood, doing this kind of stuff. But I just push back on your point about neighbourhood. I actually think Australia is a very good neighbour to Malaysia. Australia has actually, we have over generations committed to our relationship with Malaysia. We have fought over Malaysia. We fought to defend Malaysia repeatedly in the Second World War, in the Malayan emergency, in the post-Malayan emergency era. We contribute through the five-power defence arrangement directly to the security and stability and implicitly the prosperity of Malaysia through our military investment there, let alone the scholarships, let alone the investment over generations through the Colombo Plan and subsequent engagement. Now, you know, you and I both know Malaysia and Australia are close, trusted partners. I'm a former military officer. I was an instructor at Duntroon, our military college. One of my trusted counterparts was a Malaysian officer, where there's a Malaysian officer in the training schools in Malaysia as well. These are trusted, close, collaborative relationships. And there are moments when there are sparks. Of course, that friends do that. Even siblings fight. But, you know, the idea that we're not part of the neighbourhood, well, that's not my perception. I chaired a conference, a counterterrorism regional conference here at the ANU a couple of years ago. It was very interesting. It was a Singaporean person, no names, no pactual, but he said at the conference, you know, Australia is the country we in ASEAN dislike the least. Sorry, and it was kind of a backhanded compliment, you know, because nobody likes the others. The other is unlikable, but there's something about Australians. I like to believe, and maybe I'm kidding myself, but I have quite a few people have given me this impression that people do appreciate that Australia has a manner that is actually useful. We play a constructive role in the neighbourhood, sometimes a slightly clod-hopping one, but nonetheless, in the grand scheme of things, a constructive one that helps. Even if you look back, it's really interesting. You think about Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister, who in 2007 came up with this Asia-Pacific community. You know, we came about it in a very clod-hopping way, a very insensitive way. It was announced, a great Australian idea. Richard Butler went around the region trying to ingratiate the idea with the locals, and of course it fell completely flat, in part because we hadn't bothered to check with people first. We hadn't bothered to socialise the idea before we announced it. But as it turned out, the idea wasn't such a bad one, because the idea behind the Asia-Pacific community is effectively what the East Asia Summit became. It expanded to meet the expectations of that model that Kevin Rudd had put up. Now, Kevin didn't get the glory for it. You know, arguably he shouldn't have. But nonetheless, Australia actually played, I believe, a constructive role in being a bit of an icebreaker. We were the bull in the china shop, and maybe some of the china needed to be busted up a bit. But certainly the consequences and the cleanup of that bust up is, I would put to you, quite a constructive one. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move on to the next question. This is one asked by Adrian Tan. It seems the developing countries of ASEAN are in the middle of a new Cold War between America and China. Are the actions of Australia in accord with ASEAN to maintain a peaceful and cooperative region, or is Australia going to be a loyal partner to America?
Well, that's a very interesting question, but I think it's a false dichotomy. Because I think the countries of ASEAN are in a very similar position to Australia. We want peace. We want the United States to be restrained, and we want China to kind of let go a bit and actually respect the exclusive economic zones of the contiguous states of the South China Sea, and have actually to agree to a code of conduct and stop procrastinating, as it has done for 18 years, and actually maybe stop threatening smaller powers just because they're small. I think, you know, what you find, and I guess gets back to my earlier point, Australia has a brashness that I think is a convenient foil for ASEAN member states. Australia is a loyal partner of ASEAN. Australia respects the protocols of ASEAN. It works within them assiduously. Australia is a very active participant in all of the forums to which it is invited, and it plays constructively in that space. And sometimes that role is being a little bit more assertive than some of the ASEAN members might initially be happy with. But in the long run, I think that is very much with the shared interests and concerns in mind. So as I say, I don't see it as either or. Australia doesn't want there to be a clash. We want to have good relations with China and the United States. Our biggest trading partner is China. We don't want that to end, but we also don't want the wolf warrior diplomacy to continue. We don't want the kind of the checkbook diplomacy that's happened in Hanbantota in Sri Lanka to be manifest in multiple places in the Pacific, and it's on the cusp of doing that. We're seeing, I mentioned at the outset the concerns about great power contestation, but linked to that are the issues of governance. And in small states where environmental concerns are great, there are real concerns about the undue influence of great power contestation on the governance of small states. That is deeply worrying for Australia, particularly in the Pacific, amongst some of the Pacific microstates. But I think, to be fair, I know Australia is experiencing this as well. We have a business community that's torn, that is actually very uncomfortable with the government being forthright on China. So we have a national security community and a business community. There's a bit of a tussle here, which I would suggest to you replicates to a certain extent the tussle that happens in every capital city across Southeast Asia.
Oops, sorry. Thank you. We have the next question will be by Muhammad Daniel. He asked, what is your point of view pertaining to the FPDA, in which Malaysia and Australia are a part of? And does this compact is capable of preventing the ever-growing hegemony of China, such as the disputes over the Spratly Islands and China's demands over the South China Sea?
Yeah, thank you. Now, look, the FPDA, Five-Power Defence Arrangement, as I mentioned in passing, arguably an anachronistic organisation. It was designed after Konfrontasi had ended, after Sukarno had lost office in Indonesia and President Suharto had come in. And there was a sense that, okay, things are better, but we want to hedge against the risk of Indonesia becoming more aggressive again. And so the arrangement is a bit of a security guarantee, not a complete one, but a partial guarantee for Australia, New Zealand and the UK to work collaboratively with Malaysia and Singapore for the mutual defence interests. And that is, over time, that's become, in one sense, irrelevant. Indonesia is not worried about Australia or the UK or New Zealand, and it's not really worried about Malaysia and Singapore either. In fact, there's very successful, prosperous ties between the nations, particularly through ASEAN, but bilaterally and multilaterally as well. Today, FPDA provides a wonderful platform for collaboration, for mutual understanding, for relationship building, for checking on interoperability, but it is not the platform on which Australia or Malaysia can work to build a kind of coalition to face a confrontation in the South China Sea. That's just not likely. It's not expected. It's not what the FPDA is about. But it is, as I say, a very useful platform for the five nations to work on interoperability, trust, benchmarking, cross-checking each other's capabilities, learning from each other's experiences and latest operational lessons and capability refinements. From that point of view, Australia derives great benefit from it. And I like to think Malaysia and the others do as well. I think the proof's in the pudding. It's now going on 50 years old and no one's talking about it going away because it just has enduring utility. It really works. It's really useful. It's not, a silver bullet to all the world's problems, but it is nonetheless a very useful arrangement that has enduring utility.
And John, would your question, would your idea on monies, would it be built on the FPDA or would it be a separate thing altogether?
No, it would be, look, it's partly inspired by the concept of the FPDA, but it would be a very different arrangement because it wouldn't be about defence. It would be about regional maritime cooperation on a range of issues. Bali the Bali summit related type issues like people smuggling, illegal fisheries, piracy, terrorism, a range of issues that those 5 countries in that shared maritime space have a lot to collaborate over. And it particularly, I mean, I'm acutely conscious that while Indonesia has a liaison officer and an observer status for the FPDA, it is not a member state of the FPDA. And as I say, understandably, Indonesia, as a self-respecting non-aligned nation, doesn't want to do that. FPDA was set up in effect against it back in the day. So no self-respecting Indonesian president's going to sign up to that. But you and I, Malaysia and Australia, we don't have a constructive sub-regional mechanism for engagement with Indonesia at the moment. We have ASEAN, but that is subject to veto and subject to many other players. So my point is that there is a space that the Manis countries share that is not about South China Sea necessarily, that is not about great power contestation, it's about the space we share and about governance and control and managing of piracy, managing of people smuggling, managing the next wave of Rohingya refugees from Bangladesh. You know, there's so many things that are in that space where we need to collaborate, cooperate effectively, and where it would be useful for us to have refined mechanisms that include Indonesia, that don't exclude it.
Thanks for that. Our next question comes from Luke Herbert. He asks, to what degree and how does Indonesia's colonial history influence their stance towards China?
You know, I'm not Indonesian, so I've written about Indonesia a little bit, and I have wonderful exchanges when I visit Indonesia, and I take students on a New Colombo plan course called Southeast Asian Security Choices, and it involves a visit to Indonesia. And my engagement there has been a very constructive one over the years. Indonesia has a bit of a love-hate relationship with China, in part because of the very interesting, the way the Chinese diaspora in Indonesia has operated and how it's become influential and wealthy and yet not assimilated to the Islamic faith and not essentially identifying as Malay, although many of them obviously speak Bahasa. And so there's been a history of rancor, of strife, of burnings, of prosecution, of persecution of the Chinese minority, largely out of resentment. It's very interesting to contrast that with the situation in a country like Thailand, where you also have quite a large Chinese diaspora, but one that is culturally not as remote from Malay Muslim identity, and I think one that has managed to assimilate into the Thai mainstream in a way that the Chinese Indonesians have not. And that leaves a legacy for Indonesia's relations with China. That means that there's a level, I think, and I may be oversimplifying it, so I'm happy to stand corrected, but my sense is that there is a level of distrust and unease about China's engagement in Indonesia. While they're happy to take money and they're happy to take investment, there nonetheless remains an underlying unease about China's assertiveness in Indonesian space. And that, I think, colours the relationship, and that manifests itself in various ways.
We have an attendee with a raised hand. We have Dr. Stephen Leong that's gonna ask his question. Hold on, we're going to let him speak.
Yep.
Dr. Steve, can you hear us?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, Stephen, yes, please.
Thank you indeed, Professor, for a very insightful and informative presentation. It's good to know about the Plan B Australian program, and I can fully understand that the need for Plan B and looking at the need to engage with regional countries and powers. you mentioned the middle role status of Australia. I've always been a keen supporter of the role of middle powers. I remember your former Foreign Minister Gareth Evans also promoting it. And when we look at it, why not with Australia and other middle powers, Canada for that matter, and ROK, perhaps even among ASEAN countries, Vietnam and Indonesia, Malaysia too perhaps, and Japan. As recently an article written by Professor Nagi in the Japan Times, clearly referring to Japan as a middle power also. That instead of talking about this, and each country more or less alluding to this, why not Plan B for Australia to focus also on one area, and that is bringing the middle powers together as a coalition so that both can have stronger voice and position and stand vis-a-vis the two superpowers, so that indeed the middle powers can have a positive role and Australia the part of it. What do you think of this? Thank you.
Brilliant, Stephen. Thank you. I love the idea. And it resonates with the thinking of a number of my colleagues here in Canberra about the need to build on Australia's connections with the region, which I think have been undercooked and underdeveloped and underutilized. And
Yes.
The thing is that I think we need to recognize the limits. And one of the challenges here, and a colleague of mine here at the ANU, Rory Medcalf, has written about, particularly about Australia's relationship with India, and in his book on the Indo-Pacific, the name of which is, exact title of which is escaping me. I've got it here somewhere. He has talked very positively about the relationship with India, and that is actually an area where there's been considerable growth in the last couple of years. We're seeing the ties deepen and strengthen there, but I think there's also a recognition that there are limits to the natural overlap of interests between our two countries beyond, cricket and common law factors. Our geostrategic circumstances are quite different. We're not a nuclear power. They are. We don't face a land border with Pakistan or China, and our challenges internally are very different to theirs as well. So I think that's the case. You look around at a country like Japan as well. Similarly, Japan has understandable concerns. It is much closer to China physically than we are. It's very invested in China economically, and it is gravely worried about two things. One, its demographic spiral, and two, its economic decline relative to China, and the apparent uncertainty in the transactional approach that the United States has taken to its security guarantee of Japan. That has been deeply unsettling to the Japanese, and it's helped them to reach out to Australia, but once again with a level of uncertainty about just how much Australia's interests overlap with Japan's. Because while there's plenty of bonhomie and goodwill, when it comes to brass tacks, there has to be an overlap of interests. And there is concern there. Once again, I talked about fear of abandonment and fear of entrapment. The fear in policy circles that getting too close to these nations may actually complicate and make things worse in some respects, as they may get a sense of being emboldened to take risks that are inimical with Australia's interests. And so there's a real caution there, a bit of hedging going on while Australia's reaching out to the Republic of Korea, Japan, Indonesia, India, and maintaining obviously with Malaysia and others. It's mindful that all of those countries have different national interests. There are overlapping interests, and where those overlaps take place, there is opportunities for collaboration and mutual benefit. but there are limits, and that's the challenge we face today, is exploring the boundaries of those limits, particularly in the face of the great uncertainty over the great power contestation that's going across the Indo-Pacific at the moment.
Thank you very much for that. Sorry, due to the interest of time, we have only one last question to answer. And if you checked in the chat earlier, we did say this, we're going to extend this by about 5 minutes. So our last question goes to, is from Laura, who's asking about how do you interpret Australia's recent rejection of most of China's South China Sea claims? Is it a part of its plan B to further engage with Southeast Asian neighbors? Are you expecting that more US allies in the region would follow in Australia's footsteps?
Yeah, thank you. Excellent question. Look, there's a very important, I'm not an international lawyer, but international lawyers advise me that there is a precedent, a very important principle that is being pursued here in terms of Australia agreeing with the United States in not recognizing China's claim. If you stop objecting, if you stop contesting, you are de facto giving recognition. And that is something that Australia does not want to see happen. And I believe it is not in the interests of Malaysia to see happen either. Now, understandably, Malaysia is not in a position to be all that assertive back to the People's Republic of China about its claims and its assertiveness in Malaysia's exclusive economic zone. But my understanding is that Malaysia is actually quietly quite happy that Australia has been more forthright than Malaysia has been, because this is actually in Malaysia's interests. And here, I think this is where Australia has been playing the role of a constructive neighbour, of actually being more forthright. We're further away from the contested space than you are, but we have a stake in it, and we have an interest in the broader concept of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea being applied. It applies to Australia more broadly. It applies in the South Pacific, and Australia is very keen for the rules, for the arbitral tribunal rulings to be upheld, and for the conventions of the law of the sea to be maintained. And so those are enduring interests for Australia, and they are manifested at the moment in terms of the clash in the South China Sea. And from that point of view, it is something that Australia sees as important to push back on. And here's a very interesting point. And I think it's worth just deliberating on this for a moment. You know, I'm a great believer in the importance of the Chinese strategist Sun Tzu in the thinking of Chinese policy making. And one of the key points he made, one of his key dictums, was that the acme of skill is to defeat your adversary without fighting. I really believe they don't want to fight. But I do think they want to bark, and I do think they want to intimidate, and I do think they want to get away with as much as they can, as long as we back down. And so far, that has been a remarkably successful strategy. And I think the point has come where any more backdowns, and we all start losing considerably. And it really is a zero-sum game where if we lose, they win, and if they win, we lose. So I think this is where Malaysia's and Australia's interests do overlap. They might manifest slightly differently. You may not be as forthright as Australia in objecting, but I think you would probably agree that the benefits lie in Australia pursuing this approach, with Australia perhaps looking for Malaysia to, at the very least, not complain. I hope that makes sense.
Actually, John, before we let you go, can we very quickly ask you to comment on, I mean, how strong, how deep is this current consensus on China in Australia? Is this just going to, go away once Labour comes in, if Labour comes in the near future? Is this just very quickly, John, if we
so. Richard Marles, the defence spokesman, Penny Wong, the foreign affairs spokesman, both have made comments looking to be critical of the government, but essentially showing very little difference policy-wise between the positions the Australian government, the current Conservative coalition government, has been espousing. And that is because on these issues, there is considerable consensus. There is considerable unease about what's happening in the United States, just as there is unease about what's happening in Beijing. But Australia is a US partner, an alliance partner. We're invested. We benefit enormously from our relationship with them. And that's not going away anytime soon, regardless of who comes into office next.
Thanks very much, John. I will not try to even attempt to make a summary. I actually quite dislike it when people do that. But John, we do hope that we'll be able to engage with you in the future. You know, this is a very important topic for us. We are looking at Australia very, very closely because it really matters to, I guess, the calculations here as well. So, you know, I very much do hope that we'll be able to continue on here and different kinds of platforms. And of course, you know, I should also give this background that this is in part a way for us to make amends for not being able to bring you to KL for the Asia-Pacific Roundtable, which we have had to cancel because of COVID-19.
Yes.
So, you know, it's an imperfect thing, but you know, we are very thankful that you've agreed to do this.
Well, I'm greatly honoured, and I really appreciate the opportunity to engage with you and the audience. I really think the relationship we have, Australia-Malaysia, the Australia-Malaysia relationship, is of really fundamental importance to both of our nations. Australia has invested for generations in this space. You are important to us. I like to think we're important to you, and I hope that this talk has helped in fostering better ties between our two nations. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. And with that, I guess we'll end. We'll be putting this up on YouTube, I guess, in a couple of days. And and thanks to all the participants for your questions and your interactions. Thanks.
Terrific. Thank you.
Bye-bye, John.
Bye-bye then.